This is the first episode of G.I. Joel at the Movies. So this is going to be a new series where I'm going to be going over and reviewing some of the hottest movies that are currently in the box office or ones that I've watched that I think you should really check out. In this first episode, I'm going to be talking about the all-new Denis Villeneuve movie that just came out yesterday, the 22nd of October, Dune. But before I get into my thoughts on this film, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and bell notifications so you don't miss any future updates or episodes. So for those of you that don't know, I am a huge fan of Dune. I've loved the books for most of my adult life. My dad actually introduced me to Dune when I was a lot younger with the sci-fi original miniseries that they did on the Sci-Fi Channel many years ago. And I have been absolutely looking forward to this movie for the last 2 years. I'm also a big fan of Denis Villeneuve and his body of work. I think he's a fantastic director. And seeing Dune being adapted to the big screen has been a dream of mine, and to see one of my all-time favorite stories and favorite properties being adapted by one of my favorite directors was really rewarding. I'm going to be focusing on several key areas during this review, right? Cinematography, the soundtrack and the visual effects, writing and acting, with writing probably being broken down into things like dialogue, exposition, source material accuracy, etc., and things like that. But first off, let's go ahead and start off with the cinematography. So this film was seriously visually stunning and was a masterpiece for the eyes. I'm so glad that I saw this in an IMAX theater so I could just be totally encompassed by that humongous screen. And that's the way that this movie was filmed, and I believe it's the way that it's meant to be enjoyed is on the IMAX. The scale and the grandeur of the establishing shots, the visual cues meant to represent things like Paul's vision of time and the development of his character internally. The camera movements, the angles, they all really created an all-encompassing visual experience. Not to mention, things like the colors and the blocking were all really perfect and really told the story visually, something that has probably been debated of whether or not you could do with Dune, but he told the story through your eyes. Every frame and every movement of the camera translated something different, from the screen to you as the viewer. So it was really a perfect example of visual storytelling. Next up, for sound and effects, the soundtrack for this movie was truly out of this world. Hans Zimmer definitely, without a question, deserves an Oscar for this movie. The sound used to communicate intent, motivation, emotion. It worked beautifully with the cinematography to really just deliver an experience, both visually and audible, to really communicate a story to you. The effects were incredible in establishing the scale and the grandeur of this world. The sandworms, the Spacing Guild freighters, the environment, everything was so much larger than life and felt so real and so developed from a visual angle and from listening to it, the sounds for things, the music, even the instruments that they were using, you couldn't even tell what they were. It was just absolutely incredible. I did see a sneak peek interview and everything where Denis Villeneuve was talking with Hans Zimmer about this movie, and he actually created instruments specifically for this film. I mean, he literally created instruments to use because he wanted it to sound otherworldly, and it really did. And another visual aspect of this movie that's something that normally doesn't grab my attention were the costumes. I mean, the costumes in the wardrobe, that was probably one of my favorite parts, and that's, like I said, it's not something I typically notice, and it really helped develop the feeling of this really thought out and thorough world. Next up is writing, and for me, writing is something that I'm kind of a big stickler for. I'm really not a huge fan of a lot of exposition dumps. I understand that to an extent they have to be in movies, but you should be able to see the story. You don't have to tell me the story. Dialogue, the overall storytelling and plot techniques used, and everything like that. I think the movie, of course, truly rests on the writing, and especially when it comes to something being adapted from a book, how does it work as an adaptation in terms of source material accuracy? And I gotta say, overall, Dune did a great job of this. Throughout this film, there was a lot of world building and laying the foundation for the very expansive, very intricate universe that is Dune. Many of the different factions and houses and everything were really built up. The characters, we had this great foundation laid to build more stories upon. You know, one of the things that worried me most about going into this film was, how do you explain Dune to a new audience without wasting a lot of unnecessary time on exposition? And Villeneuve totally knocked this out of the park. You know, being able to communicate what's going on inside the characters' minds. What are they thinking? What are they currently experiencing? What are they feeling? He did a great job of, really, the dialogue was just used to kind of further those things, and the exposition was kept to a minimum. He used every other sense possible to truly communicate the story to its fullest extent, and I think it really has set up a fantastic world with some really great characters, and really set up a perfect foundation, like I said, for a sequel and for subsequent movies to come after this. I think it is perfect in that way. As an overall adaptation of a book, it was fairly accurate. I mean, he did cut some of the things like the intergalactic politics and everything, things that people don't really enjoy hearing about in a movie, you know, the balance of power between the Emperor and the Landsrot and things like that. He kind of cut some of that stuff out. And there were a couple of scenes that, you know, really probably aren't necessary in a storytelling for a movie. And they are scenes that really added anything other than like another layer of character depth, which he still managed to do through what he did. So overall, it was as accurate to the books as I would want it to be, without it completely, you know, taking me out of the experience and being like, oh, that never happened, this didn't happen, things like that. So overall, it was a great adaptation. He stuck true to the source material. I know Villeneuve is a huge fan of the book series, so he did a fantastic job in terms of adaptation. The dialogue was used perfectly and balanced perfectly. Exposition kept to a minimum. The writing was knocked out of the park, an absolute grand slam. The last category is going to be acting. I think every casting choice for this was absolutely perfect. Timothée Chalamet was a perfect Paul. I mean, he looked the right age, he felt the right age, you know, just everything about it. He really captured Paul Atreides and who he is in this part of the story. I think Oscar Isaac really captured the honor and the stoicism and the mentality of Duke Leto. You know, Duke Leto, even in the books, like, it said that, you know, Paul is a portion of Duke Leto. Like, you know, the son is the sum of the man, of the father, you know, and I think he really kind of embodied that, and he did a really great job of kind of laying out who the House Atreides is. I mean, he was a bigger representation of not just Duke Leto, but he really represented House Atreides as a whole really perfectly. Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck, I mean, he was born for that role. Absolutely perfect for Gurney. Jason Momoa, of course, was an incredible Duncan Idaho. And I'm really hoping, you know, as we get closer to the next movie, or whenever the next movie comes out, that we get more of Stephen Henderson's Thufir Hawat. Hawat is one of my favorite characters from the book. And we really didn't dive into the Mentats too much in this movie, which it makes sense that why he didn't do that. I totally get it. The Mentats is a really convoluted, or, you know, really complicated kind of faction to talk about and to really delve into. He used visual cues to kind of show what they're capable of doing and things like that. And I am sure he's going to explore more of that in the subsequent movies and everything. But yeah, Thufir is one of my favorite characters. I think, you know, Stephen McKinley Henderson was a great choice to play him, and I'm really excited to see them expand on that character later on. Overall, this movie is honestly a perfect 5 out of 5 for me. I mean, everything about it was engrossing. It was a true just experience to see this movie. So if you're gonna see it, I highly recommend you see it on IMAX, or at least in theaters the way that it was intended to be seen. You know, don't watch it on HBO Max or at home unless you have like a professional grade sound studio at your house and movie theater. Then yeah, watch it at home. But it was really meant to be seen on the big screen, in the IMAX, in an all-encompassing kind of environment where you can really just dive into it and experience it for what it's meant to be. You know, and a sequel is not yet guaranteed for this movie by Warner Brothers, so I'm very sure they're going to be watching these box office numbers extremely closely to determine whether or not we're going to get a sequel. And, you know, my final thoughts on this, to kind of sum up everything in a simple kind of couple of sentences, you know, for a very long time, Dune has been considered an unadaptable movie, that it would never work for the big screen, that it would be too confusing, too dense, too convoluted for the average moviegoer, and it was in a lot of ways considered an impossible task. And well, Denis Villeneuve has done the impossible. And as influential as Dune was in literature, I believe this movie will be just as influential when it comes to the future of cinema. Well, that is it for this very first episode of G.I. Joel at the Movies. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and bell notification so you don't miss any future episodes or updates. Let me know, have you seen Dune yet? Are you going to be watching it in theaters? If you did see it, what were your thoughts? I would love to get a chance to speak with you in the comments, and I'll see you later.